So if I could have your attention. We'll go into the final session. I expect that at least some portion of our group would have a low tolerance for lengthy introductions. And I think that I will just say that each of the persons on the panel is a faculty member at Harvard Divinity School, each with his or her own specialty, but all with a serious interest in the city and a commitment to making it better and to helping this Divinity School be a contributing factor in that process. And I am very glad that each of them, Davíd Carrasco, Harvey Cox, Robert Orsi, and Stephanie Paulsell, were sufficiently interested and committed to the ideas and processes that we're engaged in here to spend the day with us to share reflections on what we have heard, what we've seen, what we've done together, and to give us some comments. What I ask that they do is to identify a few of the things that they considered most significant. No way to do all of that, but and to share that, to give it back to us in their own formulation, and insofar as they think appropriate, to give some insight into what sort of a theological dimension there was in this. Davíd objected to my characterization of him as a theologian, but as you know, the framework that I use to think about theologians is those who do theology. Some are, have different takes on it than others, and there's been a lot of it being done here today. Davíd has agreed to start us off, and he will come to this podium and speak. I don't know whether the others wish to stand to speak, but that's up to each person. And we'll get going. Thank you, Davíd.
I'd like to thank, first of all, Lowell Livesey and his crew for organizing this very important gathering where folks who, before today, many were strangers, now are in communication with each other. And I think we owe Lowell a very warm round of applause for Lowell did ask me and other members of the panel to come in and give some reflections on what we heard today, and he kept inserting this notion of talking about the theology of what we heard today. And I decided that what I would do, rather than talk about the theology of what I heard today, was talk about the gospels that I heard today. I heard this gospel and that gospel and a whole bunch of gospels. But before I get to my gospels that I heard, I wanted to tell you about something that happened to me during the break in relation to the title of this conference, which to me is kind of problematic. Faith in Boston. Faith in Boston. It's not like Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas. But in fact, during the process of the presentations today, there's a lot of fear and loathing in the history of Boston. And I was walking over there to my office, and I met a student of mine who took a course with me in the extension school, which is to say that she's a real adult. And I said to her, she said, "Oh, Professor, Profe, how are you doing, Profe?" I said, I'm here for this course, this conference called Faith in Boston. And you thought we had rehearsed this thing, because out of her mouth came, "Faith in Boston. Faith in Boston." I have no faith in Boston. I've lived here all my life. I'm an Irish Catholic. I have no faith in this city. In this city, you can get any government you want as long as you got the money to buy it. That's what she said. And that made me think about faith in Boston in terms of some of the many struggles that you have been talking about. And some of the things that have been said, like Alan Callahan thinking about Boston in terms of the notion of apartheid, and what Robert Orsi was talking about in terms of thinking about where we came from in this city, in terms of trying to recover a new, complicated sense of the history of these neighborhoods, not just call them white and black and brown and Latino, but to try to understand the human dynamics. And it seemed to me that a number of you were responding to this with a number of gospels. I heard the following gospels. I heard the gospel of empowerment of the inside and the outside. I heard the gospel of the bounce check. I heard the gospel of accidental multiculturalism. I heard the gospel of apartheid as a long event in Boston. I heard the gospel of the very short list. I heard the gospel of youth at risk. I heard a gospel of opening the doors. I heard the gospel of standing together. I heard the gospel of 24/7, you know. And I heard what I think was the overall gospel of today. I would call it the gospel of going down there together to get things done about all the people we know who are at risk. That's the way I would sum up the gospel that I heard today. The gospel of going down there together to get things done for the people we all know who are at risk. And going down there together in this particular group meant not just going down there together with each other, but for most of us it meant going down together with Jesus. Because it was very clear that so many of you are going down there together, wherever you're going, to do your struggle out of a sense of a personal, powerful, empowered relationship with Jesus. And so it seemed to me that that's what I heard to be the underlying gospel of today. Now, in thinking about this, I heard three major themes coming through all of these gospels. The first was one I already mentioned, and that's the idea of coming up with more complicated, more humane, more human types of narratives about this city and about these communities. I think that Professor Orsi was talking about that when he emphasized the notion of talking about demography in terms of where we come from. He's asking us to deprovincialize our histories and ourselves, not only deprovincialize ourselves about the neighbors in our community and the people coming into our communities, but deprovincialize ourselves about our own family histories, so that we don't just reduce ourselves to these type of powerful, clunky categories. And he was asking us to see these complicated but wonderful, untold histories, not only in terms of problems to be solved, but resources for us, so that we can address things like not ministering to stereotypes, but ministering to individuals, to peoples, to human beings who are not stereotypes. It seemed to me that he was asking us to think about the whole question of ministering to these types of people so that we can think about work, the whole process of work, and having a healthier understanding about work. What was interesting about this to me as a Mexican American, when he was talking about the whole question of time, and do different communities have different notions of time? Well, in the Mexican community, we do have a different notion of time. And I don't mean the mañana time that you're all thinking about. But since Mexican culture, like many Catholic cultures, is very much tied up with festivals. In Mexican culture, we always having these festivals. And so you say, well, you going to work today? No, man, we're having a festival today. How long does it last? 3 days. 3-day festival, and people really get together and they do festival and they eat and they travel and they relax and they talk. They've done studies, they've done some very good studies in this country of Mexicans who come into this country, and you know that Mexicans get sicker after they come into this country than when they leave Mexico. Within one generation, the second generation of Mexicans are much sicker in this country than the parents are when they come over from Mexico with their own notion of time and rhythm. And it seemed to me this was a very important thing to think about. So this idea of new narratives, new history, a theology that is informed by this type of better history. The second thing I heard that was impressive to me, the second theme, was a kind of discourse, a kind of argument between, on the one hand, the neighborhood and partnership view of the Boston we have faith in or no faith in, and the realization that we live in a city. And as Brother Callahan said, every city that's ever been created on this earth was created at a moment when permanent hierarchies were established in the community. All urban demographers who have studied the rise of cities on this earth and then the development of cities will tell you that one of the things that is a permanent part of cities is social hierarchy. To put it in simple terms, once cities were created, there was always a differentiation in the community of people's access to the gods and the goods. The elites always claimed that they had better access to the gods and the goods. And they would speak for the rest of the people in terms of how they would get distributed the gods and the goods. That's why it's so important to have people here today who are saying, oh, no, we got access to the gods and the goods, but we do it in terms of our own faith and our own practices. But in cities, you never really get the same access. And so imagine that if every city like Boston, even if everybody was all white or all black or all brown in this city, there'd be this problem of hierarchy. And if you're going to do ministry in faith, you got to have to face up to that. And it seemed to me that this is a problem because in the discourse I heard today, in terms of, well, the busing kind of ruined the neighborhood. I'm sure the busing was obviously very painful in this society. But these neighborhoods were already in trouble before there was busing. They were in a lot of trouble in this city before there was busing. And the generation before that, there was a lot of trouble in these cities because cities are places where people are at risk. You know, I was thinking about this marvelous book by Raymond Williams, a Marxist scholar, called The City and the Country. He was sort of studying the whole history of England in terms of his literature. And he was studying it in the 80s, and he said, you know, in the 80s, you read people who are writing this literature in their old age, and they say, man, when I was young, when we were kids, we didn't live in these crappy cities. We lived out in this wonderful country that's called England. And so he said, that's amazing. So he went back and read the literature of the 30s. When these people were young, and all the literature that day said, man, England was ruined by World War I. But when we were kids, we were Shropshire lads. And we lived in the time of Shropshire, where we were out there with those animals and those farms and those early mornings, and it was wonderful. So he went back to the 1880s, and they said, man, the Industrial Revolution has ruined our place, man. But when we were kids, we lived out here in this wonderful community where we had neighborhoods. And he did this, and he went all the way back to the Aeneid. And he gets back to the Aeneid, and that's what they're saying. These foreigners came in here and they ruined our community. So it's very important, I think, to think about whatever moments change Boston, to realize that part of the struggle here and part of the construction of the new history and part of this struggle between the neighborhood and the city is that the cities are places where there's going to always be a group of people who are more at risk. And if you add on to that the whole problem of slavery, where black people come in here and they got the extra hierarchy to deal with. We got some deep work to do here. Which led me to the third point that I heard today, which was this whole discourse on race and the gospel. What someone said, it was race, this cooked up idea. This is a cooked up idea. And I think here we saw some very wonderful presentations where I really saw these gospels coming forth. This whole question of the racialization of religion, so important in terms of housing, jobs, education, the black middle class, and the way in which some of these churches have been trying to develop communities to affirm African American communities. Why do people want to have an African story? Why do some people want to have a Latin American story here? I'll tell you why we want to have a Latin American story. Because we grow up in communities that are always looking at us and telling us that we're not part of this other story. We're not part of the Boston story. Boston didn't come to us. It fell on us. And we just had a publication here at this campus by a guy named Sam. I don't even want to say his last name. And he's written a new book, and the book has come out and said the biggest threat in this country is all these Latinos who come rushing across the border because they're going to split this democracy in two, because they're going to want to speak Spanish, and that you better watch out for them. But while you're watching out for them, get your backlash going against them. So, of course, people want to look at African resources and Latin resources and other resources, because these other resources tend to be diminishing people. This seemed to be a very important part of this whole question of the celebration of the church. Now, I'm going to come to an end, because I don't want to take up too much time. You heard about my Gospels. Let me just say one or two things quickly about this. I think one thing that wasn't addressed today very well, and that was this whole question of the Latino dimension of faith in Boston. I'll tell you a little story about this. Happened to me last week. I was invited down to Appalachia to give a talk to the hillbillies. Hillbilly community asked me to come down and give a talk. There's a little college in a part of Virginia I didn't know existed. This part of Virginia I didn't know existed. They asked me to come down and speak at the Southwestern Virginia Community College out in the coal fields. And I didn't know what I was getting into, and I was going down there to give a talk at this college. And I got there early, and I went to the local little eating place, and a place called the Waffle and the Egg. And I was sitting in there trying not to be too outstanding, reading my newspaper. And the waitress, this very nice waitress, white lady, came up to me and said, "You're not from around here, are you?" And I said, "Well, no." She said, "Well, where are you from?" So I said, "What am I going to say?" So I said, "Well, I'm from Boston." And she said, "Oh, Boston." She said, "What are you doing here?" I said, "Well, I'm going to talk up at the college." She said, "What are you going to talk about?" Well, now the title of my talk, which I wasn't going to tell her, was "Zoot Suiters and Lowriders Come to Your Town." So I thought about it. And I said, well, I fell back into a biblical mode. I said, I'm talking about the stranger. The stranger comes to town. And whether people want to be good Samaritan or treat the stranger bad. And she said, "You know, we were just talking about that this morning in here in the restaurant." She said, because she didn't know who I was. She said, because we got Mexicans in this town. I said, "Yeah, sure enough." She said, "Yeah, we got Mexicans in this town." She said, "And they come in here, and the people here don't like them." And I said, She said, "The people don't like them." She said, "But," she said, "you know, these people, they work like dogs, these Mexicans." And she said, "I think it's really sad." So I thought maybe I had a friend here. And I said, "Well, why do you think it's sad?" She said, "Because they work like dogs, and they work for money that nobody else here will take." And she said, "It bothers me." I said, "What bothers you?" She said, "Yeah, it bothers me." She said, "You know, the problem is we can't speak their language. I only know one word in Spanish." I said, "Oh, what is it?" She said, "Mañana." I said, "Okay." And she said, "But, you know, I think we should help these people." And I said, "Well, that's a good attitude." And she said, I said, "Isn't it part of the problem that these people will pay them so much less than other people, so therefore they take them?" She said, "Yeah, that's part of the problem." And she said, "You know, I used to hate the niggers." I said, "Really?" She said, "Yeah, but I don't hate them anymore." She said, "I was wrong to hate them." She said, "Now, I could hate the Mexicans, but I would be wrong to hate them." And then she had this line. I'm still trying to figure out what it meant. She said, "You know why I don't hate the Mexicans and the niggers?" I said, "No, why?" She said, "Because God made them the way they are." And I said, "Well, okay, I'll take that. I'll take that as a good one." She said, "God don't make them the way they are." So the next day I went up and gave my talk, and I talked all about Peggy. Peggy was her name, and I put Peggy right in the middle of the talk. Students all knew her, but I made her the hero, because the last thing she said was, "I think that if we give them something, we will get something in return." And I think that that's really what this faith in Boston is all about. And I think the last thing I would like to say in terms of what I've experienced here was expressed in the performance that we saw today, because the performance really impressed me. And it seemed to me that in that performance is the theology. We were told the performance was about a test by God in the days of evil, to stand and wait and seek for God face to face. And you remember the language was, even if everything else was falling apart and your heart is broken, you have a friend in Jesus to help wipe away your tears. She said, "Know that I can stand." I would say, "Know that we can stand, because joy comes in the morning, because I have a friend in Jesus. But you also have to say you got a friend in Jesus, and there's friends of Muhammad, and friends of the Buddha, and friends of Guadalupe. And she says, no matter how tough life is, there's hope in the morning. And it seems to me that this is not just about a miscarriage. It's about the miscarriages of justice. It's about the miscarriages of faith in Boston. And perhaps out of some sort of conference like this, we can avoid some of those miscarriages in the future. So that's my idea of theology.
Thank you very much. I notice everybody has something about time and what they say, so I have to too. I guess I just have to ask the rest of you to divide up the rest. Well, it was too good to interrupt. You saw me sort of squirming in my seat. Anyway, in the order that you wish, please take the rest of the time to share comments. You're dividing up 33 minutes. No, that doesn't leave time for comments. If you can be briefer, we can. If you do that, we'll have a little. Okay.
I don't want to speak to you, Harvey.
So, I'll try.
Hi, I'm Harvey Cox. I sure wish I could strike up conversations with waitresses the way my colleague Davíd Carrasco does. I don't know how he does it. Maybe if I shave my head and let my hair grow a little longer, I'll get in some better talks too. The word stranger is the one that I would like to turn to today. And it's been mentioned several times. It was just mentioned by David. It made me think of the ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle, who once asked in one of his writings, what is a city? And he explores various ideas. Well, is a city a place that has a wall around it? Well, no. You can have very tiny places, not a city, has a wall around it. Is it a place with a huge population? No. You can have old nations where it's not really a city. What's a city? He said a city is a place where strangers meet. That's what defines a city. A place where strangers meet. What has struck me in listening to our conversation today is we have a city, it's called Boston, where there are a lot of strangers who don't meet each other very often. And if they do, the meetings are not particularly friendly or amiable in most instances. A lot of strangers. We have a lot of people who meet, but they're not strangers, mainly. In either kind of parish or church that was described, whether it's a bonding church or whether it's a bridge church, most of these people are not meeting strangers, at least not meeting them very often. And yet somehow or another what seems to be happening in many of the churches that we heard about today is a risky going out and coming in of people with whom the people in the congregation are not particularly familiar and not particularly comfortable. We've heard that dealt with a number of times here. What do you do with these folks, Wesley asses, in the church who really don't know what to make of these kids who are being brought in the youth program? The kind of language they use, the kind of clothes, music, and all the rest. I wonder if it might also be a good gospel insight, David, that the way God chooses often to meet us in the world is through a stranger. Through a stranger. I was thinking when I was listening to all this about, if you excuse a kind of homiletical reference, to the disciples on the road to Emmaus. Absolutely downcast, depressed, disappointed. The guy on whom they had put all of their hopes had been picked up by the Roman security forces and had been executed. It was, as far as they were concerned, all over. They were pretty far down. When a stranger began walking along with them, they didn't know who it was. They talked with them. They talked to them. Funny little game going on there. Jesus apparently knew who he was. They didn't know who he was. And they say, you don't know what's been going on in this town the last couple of weeks? Where have you been? They walk along, they come to a place, they sit down around a table, and they have a meal. And suddenly, they recognize him. They recognize Jesus. And everything starts over again. Everything looks different because God has met them in this stranger. And Jesus himself once was talking about, inasmuch as ye have done it unto the least of these, 25th chapter of Matthew, people come to him and say, but when did we feed the hungry or visit people in prison? We don't remember reading. When you did it to the least of these, you did it to me. See, this is part of what in theology we call Christology, not just ecclesiology. This is where, according to very much of the biblical fabric and the gospel stories, this is where God is waiting to meet us. So along with David's eloquent point of going out there, I think he was quoting somebody who said this earlier, going out there to work with those in need, going out there with Jesus to work with those in need. I would like to add the possibility going out there to meet the people in need and therefore to meet Jesus. Perhaps waiting in unexpected places to encounter us, to call us, to correct our view of ourselves, of the world, of the city, outside of the walls of the church, outside of the parish, still there already, even before our mission gets there. I think a careful and honest, comprehensive view of the biblical narrative of where people meet God, it's in these unexpected places, through unexpected people that you wouldn't think of as talking good church language, using the wrong adjectives even perhaps, Wesley, and things of that nature. So I introduced that at least as a thought that came to me that might even be called theological. I think we're getting there, aren't we, David? Moving toward theology. All right. Do I have time for one? I think one other point. One more point. Short point. Yes. One of the reasons why I think it's important to meet God, and that God does meet us in the unfamiliar, in the stranger, in the person that we haven't seen around this neighbor. You're not from around here, are you? I can imagine the people at the inn at Emmaus saying that when you're not from around here, are you? One of the reasons is that for many people who are comfortable church people, in the suburbs at least, or in comfortable cities, God, the image of God most people have in America today is very user-friendly. He's a really nice guy. And he's really on our side all the time, especially in this titanic struggle against evil in the world. He's on our side. Well, again, open the Bible and look that there are times where God really isn't on our side. He's really confronting us. He's really judging us. He's asking us to think again about what we're doing, not to pile all the good into our wagon and see all the evil out there. And we don't know about that until we meet people who are different, people who challenge us, people whose language and lifestyle is different. A few years ago, many years ago, 25 years ago, was Gibson Winter wrote the book about the city, the church and the city. He made a wonderful suggestion, which I wish we could take up again sometime. 35 years ago, the idea of organizing the churches in a metropolitan area, not in their denominational clusters, not inner city churches and suburban churches, but what he called pie-shaped pairings, which would mean you'd have churches that are way out there in the suburbs that may be very, very high on money and a little low on spirituality. And you got churches in the inner city or in the gray area who have vibrant spirituality, but the exchequer is a little low. Now this really calls out for a wonderful kind of partnership. Not just a partnership of money flowing in, but a partnership of learning and being with each other and programming it. That is, having the choirs exchange, having the kids go to camps together, having the adults coming back and forth. We have to keep fighting against the kind of built-in segregation of the different sectors of the city from here out to there. And I think churches can do that. I think churches can contribute to that. so that we begin not just meeting the people we know, but begin meeting strangers and therefore begin to really be a city. Thanks.
Well, if Harvey said we were on our way to theology, that journey is about to be interrupted very briefly, because actually I'm not a theologian. So I have 4 points to make. All of them come out of today's this conversation. So here, let me first say how honored I have been to be a participant in this conversation and to have been invited by Lowell to have joined this work today. And so if my comments take on a critical edge, a serious critical engagement is my form of honoring my conversation partners. So here's the first point I want to make, and that is this. Ever since the 1830s in the United States, I think it can be said that Christian groups have largely demonized the city. Christian groups have been largely responsible for an anti-urban discourse in American history. That goes. Some of it was fear of Catholics. Some of it was fear of immigrants. But American Protestantism, beginning in the days of the early Republic, generated a consistently anti-urban discourse. I have to say, I heard some of that today. And so the question number one that I want to ask is, how has the city been constructed today in relationship to the church? I heard two entities being compared, or two entities being set up in relationship to each other. One was the church, the other was the city. I heard talk about the streets. I heard talk about the church. I was struck by the way in which the city, in the language, in much of the discourse today, was seen as dangerous, as threatening. And I have to say, that's a resonant language in American Protestantism, but let me just speak here from outside that tradition and say that actually the cities are also exciting, interesting, vibrant places where a lot of really wonderful things go on. Now, I can't speak for Boston here, but I can speak for New York. And that description is certainly true of New York, and I will leave it to Bostonians to figure out if that applies also to Boston. In other words, I think religious groups, the phrase that was used today, I think by Father Finn, which was that the church is a sanctuary, can be both a very powerful phrase but a very dangerous phrase, and it can have serious repercussions in the life of cities. So that's my first point. Even the language of reweaving the disrupted social fabric, that's all very negative language about cities. Second, very often what I heard today were echoes here of a certain kind of social gospel movement approach to the city, which is that what the church's contribution in the city is largely that of, and the phrase was used again and again, social justice. That what the churches need to do is practice a kind of social justice in the cities. That's what. And as I began to think about this theme, I began to pay attention to issues of worship. Where's worship? And here I speak, I guess, although I'm not a theologian, I did grow up in a Catholic tradition. And I may be speaking out of a Catholic sacramental world here, but I thought, are people going to talk about worship? And worship was very much inside churches. The way I heard worship being talked about today was worship was inside churches. So this is a second point following that first. The dichotomous relationship church-city. Now a second level dichotomous relationship, and that is between worship that goes on inside, social justice that goes on outside. And that left me with the question of how is worship itself transformative? Again, I think I said that I am interested in the ways in which religious people leave their churches and go out into cities and transform. So, for example, I've written a book called Gods of the City, and one of the chapters in that book, it was an edited collection. One of the chapters in that book is by a man who studied Stations of the Cross, rituals in cities. And there's an example where a worship service taken out into the streets was itself a particular kind of engagement, or Catholic processions through streets, May Day processions, or whatever. I mean, what are some of the other ways in which religious groups, out of their lives of worship and prayer, engage the realities of the city? Engage the realities of the city. So that's point two. Point three, it has to do with churches today were consistently presented as sites of harmony and sites of coming together in cities. I fear it is my responsibility to point out that churches are also sites of disharmony in cities, sites of tension and disruption. I've done field work in Phoenix, Arizona, for example, where I'd say that one of the most intense social conflicts in South Phoenix is that between Pentecostals and Catholics. And it's a very unforgiving kind of tension, actually. It's both sides are pretty entrenched right now. I mean, there are groups that are trying to sort of bridge, but they're not the main figures. And so I think it's necessary as we think about the role of religion in cities. We have to pay attention to the fact that among those roles has been social disruption and social division and social divisiveness within neighborhoods, within families, within communities. Religion is not always a force for good. It's not always a force for cohesion. Finally, I'm wondering, it was also said that the churches are liminal spaces, spaces that again are different from what goes on outside. That to me raises the question of how do churches become liminal cities? And I am at 5 minutes, so I'm going to stop. But I want to say, how do churches become liminal spaces? I think we should not simply say, well, churches are places where community takes shape. That's too easy. I need accounts of how those communities take shape, what forces militate against those, and so forth. But that's it. So thank you.
Thank you. I'll be very brief. I have 2 points really and one little constellation of questions. But before I begin, I would like to say to Simon Mannering and Diane Rollert and Terry Cisse, what a joy it was to learn from you today, our students who did such a beautiful job. And all the students who have participated in Lowell's project. I have been listening today as somebody who's very involved in curricular reform. Here at the Divinity School, we are thinking again, we are turning to our curriculum really for the first time since the 80s to think again about how best to prepare the kinds of ministers that we've met today, ministers deeply involved in the life of the world. And so the thesis of Lowell's 4 theses that he gave us this morning, the one that really resonates with me the most and that I want to think about the most is, he said, if a community is involved in theological work, it is necessarily involved in cultural work. And I think I heard Reverend Herman Hamilton say that whenever a religious community is involved in cultural work, it is in fact involved in theological work, something I very much want to affirm. So I've been trying to think today about what sort of models of ministry have emerged here from which I might learn and our community here might learn as we continue to work to think about the education of ministers in this place. And one of them, I think, is this is in our Intro to Ministry course this year, we read St. Gregory the Great, who wrote many hundreds of years ago about ministry, and his image of ministry was of ministry as the art of arts, that it's a vocation that bears the whole weight of who we are, and I think I heard that in all the ministers who spoke today. It requires everything of us, and I thought today what artists the members of these communities are. The theologian Catherine Tanner says that, the life of faith is of necessity a life of creativity. There's much that we inherit about our faith, but none of it's really lying there like a stone in the road just to be picked up. We have these texts. We have different cultural contexts. We have pipe organs. We have drums. We have all of these materials that we've talked about today, and all of us, whether we're ministers, ordained, or lay leaders, or youth, we're all putting these things together in different ways, making up these gospels that David spoke of today. And that has really struck me about this conversation today, how much the life of faith is itself the life of the artist, the life of the creative person, that we all have these disparate materials that we are trying to put together in a way that allows life to flourish. The second observation I have about a sort of model of ministry that emerged today, and I'm glad to be able to be saying this after Bob Orsi's comments because they're very challenging to me on this. I heard there was a lot of bridge language. Simon in particular, I think, used a lot of that language in his presentation. There's a lot of language of intersection, which Bob heard a lot as dichotomies, and I think that's the danger. But it seems to me that there is some hope in some of this that we heard today, that communities are construing public and private, church and city, adults and youth, internal relationships within a community and a community's external relationships, not as separate spheres. At least I heard us struggling not to make those separate spheres. That, in fact, these might be places where, that maybe that's the shape of ministry for us, for our new century, is the shape of intersection. And that if a community is construed as a haven, a sanctuary, a family, the danger of that, I think, is exactly what Bob said, that it becomes opposed to everything else. But I think there's a hope here that those images do not denote an escape, but rather a deeper engagement with the life of the world. I think of the theologian Simone Weil, one of my favorite theologians, who imagined herself as inhabiting her vocation. She said, sort of on the porch of the church, at the threshold, she said, of everything that's Christianity and everything that's not. And through that intersection, living into her vocation. We've had Ephesians quoted twice today. We had it danced today, which was a great joy. And I would like to have one more quote from the letter to the Ephesians. I pray, the author writes to the church at Ephesus, that you may have the power to comprehend with all the saints what is the breadth and length and height and depth, and to know the love of Christ that surpasses knowledge, so that you may be filled with all the fullness of God. We can't see the whole scope of our work in ministry. We can't see the breadth and length and height and depth of it. And some of our beloved ministers are moving on to other positions, and the wheel continues to turn, and we pass our communities on to one another, and we hold each other up. We can't fully assess the outcomes of a life of ministry. The standard of excellence by which we measure our ministry stretches out to infinity at every point. But we can see the shape of it, I think, at the place where breadth and length and height and depth meet. For Christians, it's the image of the cross. But I think for all of the ministries that were presented here today, it's the shape of intersection. It's the shape of meeting. It is a meeting point. The few questions I would like to raise in closing, I think our conversation has focused, although we have had disagreements today, we've really focused on areas where we have a lot of agreement, a lot of shared conviction. And I wonder if we did have more time, Lowell, which I know we don't, what would our conversation look like if we probed a little more deeply into those tender places, which are often theological places, where we don't agree? What would our conversation look like if we had ordained women here with us today? What would happen if we started to probe some of the more divisive theological questions? Could the shared space that we have created today hold us up enough to talk through those? So thank you all for coming and staying, and I'll stop.
I think that my colleagues have been so disciplined because of their respect for you who have gathered here and who have shown yourselves insightful all day, so that we do have a few minutes now to hear your comments and your questions, your insights, and proposals for what should be considered further. So, is there, or we can, yes. So.
30 years ago, when I was a young Dorchester activist, and Dorchester was burning down, Mel King, then a professor at MIT, had something called the Tuesday morning breakfast group that was a source of connection and insight, a connection with other neighborhood people, and connection with academic people, and ultimately connection with public and nonprofit sector
More horizontal. Okay, good. Thank you. Others? It's Bob Bertel, another Detroit voice.
Yeah, I think one of the things that is missing, and one of the subtexts in your book, Public Religion and Urban Transformation, well, is the idea that the churches are showing us, congregations are showing us the ethical possibilities for society, and that not all of those ethical possibilities are to be praised. I mean, isn't it possible that the churches are both creating and trying to solve at the same time? And I'd like you to react to that.
Comments?
Yeah, I think that particular dynamic is very important. And the danger is always of dividing up history or social life into sort of stark dichotomies. But to think about the ways in which various forms of religious organizations are engaging social issues or engaging the life of the city, broadly speaking, not just social issues, but the life of the city, broadly speaking, for better and worse, is exactly how I think we might be thinking. That's another way of thinking about it. You're right.
Others? Warren Copeland?
I was interested in the comment about the social gospel, because my reaction to the day was quite the opposite. I guess my reaction to the day was that I couldn't see social agency on the table. It seemed to me people have a sense of what the city's doing to churches, but I didn't have a sense that anybody had much of an idea what the church would do to try to shape the city rather than be shaped by it. So I don't see much social gospel here. I really don't understand that reference.
I made the reference because of the frequent reiteration of the phrase social justice as being...
Saying it doesn't make it.
Well, that's a really big conversation that we need to have, to parse any number of the words in this conversation, whether social justice, social gospel, and so forth. But, I also think it's a misreading of the social gospel, though, to see it as one of my professors used to call it the praying arm of progressivism. Mm-hmm. And that, I think, was the praying part of it he had right, and it was progressive, too. But I think since then people have sort of taken it out of its deep Christian context and seen it as a form of social work with another name. And it never was that, I don't think. So...
I think the person who really upheld that for me today was Reverend Hamilton, when he said that he sees the resurrection in terms of housing and drug addiction, that for him those theological concepts have to be embodied in relation to these particular problems.
Mm-hmm. But he also said that in order to get his church empowered for it, they had to find a way of identifying themselves as Christians, as black people in the middle of Roxbury. And he had to do a lot of internal reconstruction that in and of itself didn't produce housing. So there's a kind of bridging of that inside-outside dichotomy, though it often wasn't articulated, and I think in many people's minds it is a dichotomy. Yeah. So... Others? Yes, ma'am. Sir.
I enjoyed this immensely. It was really rich.
Mm-hmm. Could you identify yourself, please?
Pardon?
You just identify yourself.
My name is Harvey Cox. I'm a Unitarian University.
Okay.
Worked in Pittsburgh for many years, and now I'm in Massachusetts. One question that I thought I would hear a lot more analysis, particularly theological analysis on today, is I heard a lot of references to faith-based community organizing, the GBIO. But I didn't hear a lot of analysis of the GBIO model, how it's working, and how the church is making an impact through the faith-based community organizing. And I have a particular point. I was involved in Pittsburgh for many years with a project like that. And to me it was very important, faith-based community organizing. But I always wanted a little bit more theology into it because I kept hearing the notion of self-interest, the Alinsky self-interesting. And I personally think we need somewhat better language, because to me what the church ought to be doing in that context is more transformative language. And to me self-interest somehow is stuck in a kind of old liberal model. So I just wondered if any thoughts about analyzing faith-based community organizing, particularly with GBI.
Anybody help with that? It's maybe in the it's a which
Who knows about that?
yeah
Who could
it's a well there are studies that it's a but yeah, go ahead.
I think the right thing to say is GBIO for church transition.
Yeah, I mean
Complicated story.
and indeed
Unless you really know the facts, and you probably know it more better than anybody else. The history is quite accurate.
if I know it best, then there's a dearth of knowledge. But no, I just want to say that the point is a controversial one in the understanding of faith-based community organizing, and indeed the issue of whether there are theological grounds and whether they are sort of normative in any significant way is not at all agreed upon. So the book Dry Bones Rattling by Mark Warren here at Harvard is one place that's explored. But please, Stephanie.
Well, I was just going to thank you because I think you make a great point about theological resources generally. And if I could just tell a quick story, I moved here from the south side of Chicago, and one of my neighbors, Jamie Calvin, was an activist in public housing, is an activist in public housing in Chicago. And he used to meet with the ministry students at the University of Chicago every fall for their orientation and take them around on the south side and introduce them to their new home. And he used to always say to them, he would say, I'm a completely secular person. I was not raised religious. I have no religious affiliation now. But when I meet with you guys, all I hear is Saul Alinsky. And what I want to hear from you is hospitality and justice and theological categories that come out of your traditions. There are all these great resources or organizing that you should use, but you shouldn't forget your own stuff. And I think that's really right.
Mm-hmm. Harvey?
Well, to pick up on that and go back to a remark Bob Orsi made, I mean, theology is an explosive substance which can be either constructive or destructive. And I think you gave us a good example. I had some experience a few years ago with an attempt before the Greater Boston Interfaith Organization that we're talking about to try to organize one. We had some money, we had a location, but what finally sank that effort was we didn't have any credentialing process. And as we brought in churches that are usually reluctant to be in ecumenical, or say nothing of interfaith organizations, but churches that are really doing something in the city, especially Pentecostal churches and evangelical churches, that was fine. It took a while to get them in, but then when the Hindus started coming in and the Buddhists, those people were very uncomfortable because they wanted to talk about a theological definition of what was going on, and they gradually melted away. But nobody quite had the courage to stand at the door and say, "What's your theology?" before you get into this interfaith organization. I think it's a built-in difficulty when you use theological premises in this kind of work. The other kind of theological element that I'd just like to allude to, I won't expand on it, is we sometimes say that there are theologies which are church-centered and there are theologies that are world-centered. And I like to believe that the God I think is acting in the Bible and in history is working in the world. Mm-hmm. Maybe principally, primarily, and beckoning or calling the church to get involved in what God is doing. And therefore, we have to kind of, in some ways, move. That's what I meant, going down there to meet Jesus and not just taking Jesus out there. I think both sides of that have to be there if you're basing it on a what I understand to be a biblical understanding of God.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I think there could be one more, if there is the desire. But any comments from anybody here? It's well, in that case, then, let me just say that both the praise and the challenges that have been presented here, I find kind of confirming of the contribution that the sort of research that my students have been engaged in offers, because it contextualizes large abstractions so you can explore them and begin to get at them. And, the dichotomies that Bob put up and the very important omissions that Davíd noted, they're very real. And it's just more important work to do, to get on with them. So, but I really appreciate them, and I, for my part, and of course the next round of students will have to deal with all of these dimensions that have been articulated and shaped here. I do thank not only Simon, Diane, and Terry, who I thought, you were great. But there are about 30 or 40 students who have done the work that was underlying what they were presenting. And I'm really very, very both proud of them and grateful for the fact that they would, be in the street and in the church and walking in between in order to help me, help themselves, help Harvard Divinity School, and help the congregations themselves understand the kind of engagement and embeddedness and sort of subjection to these hierarchies that are endemic to cities and considered natural by most observers, and where there's resistance, whether it's in the form of action by a Greater Boston Interfaith or whether it's the insistence that we will hold our festival even though it's not a holiday, it's still a structural action that either resists, attempts to transform, refuses to be molded, and occasionally actually changes the structure of the city. And so we've gotten a lot of glimpses of that today, and I'm grateful for all, in many, many roles, from professors, clergy, lay people, students, from many cities, and in many walks of life who have contributed to that today. I want to thank you all. I want to just point out that a big function of the conference is so that you hear and get to know each other and can find each other when you could be helpful to one another. And so we did print a contact list, which is in that windowsill. We invite you to pick one up on your way out. And also the exhibit in which many of you have shown what you do in your home church, congregation, organization. At least part of it is still there, so please stop by in Andover B at the end. Thanks again to one and all, and I hope that you've had a time that you enjoyed and that you gained as much as you contributed. Thank you.